Ukrainian nationalism historically has always been a movement in search of an enemy. And if it didn't have an enemy, it wouldn't really have a reason to exist. The whole Minsk process is an effort to get Ukraine to accept Lugansk and Donetsk back into Ukraine, but with certain rights to cultural autonomy. That's all. But Ukraine couldn't. The interesting aspect of this whole process is that the current Ukrainian government, so this is already Poroshenko and Zelensky, could not accept even a limited cultural autonomy for those regions in the Ukraine, the modern Ukraine that they envision. His only legitimacy inside Ukraine comes from the hard nationalists who support an all-out war to, if necessary, to the last Ukrainian.
Welcome, everybody. I'm very pleased to have with us Dr. Nicolai Petro. Dr. Petro is a prominent political scientist and professor of political science at the University of Rhode Island. Professor Petro has written a fascinating book titled The Tragedy of Ukraine: What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution. Professor Petro, welcome. Thank you so much for joining today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lena. Nice to be with you.
So I have to say that I'm very excited to have this opportunity to connect with you, Dr. Petro. Your recent book is absolutely unique. I read it and I enjoyed really learning so much about the internal struggles in Ukraine. And this is something that we don't really get to hear about at all here in the West. And your book does such a wonderful job of blending recent political developments in Ukraine with truly crucial historical background to portray the reality that is very much unknown to many Western political pundits who paint Ukraine as a nation that lacks diversity. And your research underscores cultural and religious pluralism within Ukraine, while also highlighting strong historic ties with neighboring Russia. So could you walk us through the main idea or the thesis of your book?
Well, the discussion is put in the framework of classical Greek tragedy. And that's the first thing that I would have to define, because according to the Greeks, a tragedy is a situation that occurs due to events that you yourself created, but you don't realize what it's going to lead to. In other words, you are the author of your own tragedy. And the failure to recognize how much you are contributing to the condition that you are in is the tragedy itself. And I thought, as I was looking at, as you correctly point out, the diversity of Ukraine, that there are not just two major cultural identities in Ukraine. There are many other minor variations, but you're right. The two major ones that have had difficulty in recent years coexisting has been the Western Ukrainian identity whose cultural nexus is located in Galicia, with its capital, Lvov or Lviv. And I would say Eastern or Malaros Ukraine. The different regions of Eastern Ukraine have different names associated with them. But it covers what is called the left bank Ukraine. So east of the Dnieper River, which has historically either been, I would say not either, both been part of Russia, just wholesale, and largely Russian speaking. The Western regions, there are four main Western provinces that have a distinctive identity. did not belong to the Russian Empire. They historically belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and for a brief period of time between World War I and World War II, to Poland. As a matter of fact, one of the fascinating things that I point out in my book is how the very origins, the recreation of the independent state of Poland came at the same time as the effort of Western Ukraine to create its own state, out of both of them emerging out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this was really a struggle between this kind of mythical struggle, which we hear so often of, between Romulus and Remus, between Cain and Abel. You know, these were two brothers, Poles and Western Ukrainians, stuck in the birth canal, and only one survived, in this case, Poland. And Poland could not exist historically without effectively ending the right of Western Ukraine to be independent. Well, over time, then the Soviet Union absorbed, after 1939, what was Western Ukraine. And as a result, we have this conflict. Although it's interesting to note that the Ukrainian nationalist movement, its historical enemy during the Austro-Hungarian Empire and up to 1939 was Poland. And they saw the Russians in many respects as allies during World War I. But once Stalin occupied those territories of Western Ukraine, then part of Poland, and annexed them, that impetus or that enemy image shifted from Poland to the Soviet Union, where and since then it's constantly, I would say that Ukrainian nationalism historically has always been a movement in search of an enemy. And if it didn't have an enemy, it wouldn't really have a reason to exist.
This is truly fascinating. In your book, you highlight that the conflict within Ukraine has been in existence for generations, as you just mentioned. And many people think that it began in 2014 or 2022, but that's when, in my opinion, it started sort of being used actively as a tool against in this
by NATO
in this proxy conflict with Russia. And you wrote that the current nationalist policies of the Ukrainian government are part of the conflict between two Ukraines, as you mentioned, Galician and Malorus, that have been fighting for generations over which one of them has the right to define what it means to be Ukrainian. And so would you say that, Ukrainian nationalist movements actually strive to create this ethno-state, a mono-ethnic Ukraine? And would they settle for a Ukraine where there is some equality between Galician and Malorus identities?
The answer to your question is no. They would not tolerate that. The entire ideology of Ukrainian nationalism, which comes into focus with the writings of Dmytro Dontsov in the 1930s, late 1920s, early 30s, and others, and other emigre writers, mostly in Poland and Germany at the time. The entire ethos of that is to create a distinctive Ukrainian identity and make the creation of a nation around that identity the reason for its existence. In other words, the nation has to be created in order that the people can exist within it. In some ways, there's a famous saying, I think by Mazzini, the Italian nationalist, who said, "We have created Italy. Now it's time to create the Italians." And to some extent, the same problem arose for Ukraine, because the only group that had a sharply I'm not even sharply, let's say a more well-defined sense of their national identity were the Western Ukrainians, who had the experience in the legislative setting of the Austro-Hungarian parliament of constantly creating political parties, many of which were defined as Russian parties at the time, and in order to make the most of the opportunities, the limited opportunities that existed within the Austro-Hungarian Empire for certain nationalities to develop a greater sense of political and cultural autonomy. This was primarily recognized by the Austro-Hungarian Empire for the Germans and the Hungarians. Then there were certain prerogatives given to Czechs and Slovenes. But other nationalities were seen as being on a sequence, leading up to maybe some sort of official recognition. But all of this happened very slowly, and eventually the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself collapsed under the weight of these self-defining nationalities. And one of the latest ones to develop was, in fact, the Ukrainian national identity. And when it was developed in the aftermath of World War I, it actually led to a split. So there were two political entities that were created. The Ukrainian Republic around the Central Rada in Kiev, whose objective was initially one of federalism within the Russian Empire and a close relationship with other Russians, as they put it. There were Malaros, Velikaros, so Black Russians and Red Russians. So the Red Russia was Galicia, actually. But at the same time, there was a counter movement stemming in Lvov of the Western Ukrainian National Republic, Zun, as it was called. And they had their own army and their own ambitions, and they didn't want to be part of Ukraine initially. They wanted their own separate republic, which they considered the truer or more proper Ukraine versus what I said on the left bank, so east of the Dnieper River. That was simply for them Russia. And Kiev occupied an ambivalent position because intellectually and culturally it was predominantly Russian, but historically it had to be claimed essentially as being the cradle of Ukrainian national identity. So its status was undetermined, but everything east of Kiev was essentially conceded to Russia culturally. So, however, both of those movements, which had a brief reconciliation in the so-called Act Zluky, so act of unification, but the Western Ukrainians were immediately betrayed by the Central Rada, by Petro, who sold out the Western Ukrainians, gave them back to Poland in exchange for Polish support against the Bolsheviks. So, as the first president of the Ukrainian Republic, independent republic, said at the time, it's endless infighting among Ukrainians because they cannot settle on who they are, where their territories are, and exactly what they are fighting for. Because there is an even more expansive project than what is currently the Republic of Ukraine, the independent Ukraine, which includes much of Kuban and the regions that Ukraine has invaded recently. So Kurska Oblast, Belgorodska Oblast, certain Ukrainian nationalists aspire to incorporate those regions into Ukraine as well, which is very perplexing when you think about it, because from a nationalist perspective, you don't want to dilute your core identity. But that is what the incorporation of much of Eastern Ukraine, and especially now the regions that are part of Russia, would do to the historical nationalist Ukrainian heartland of the four Western regions.
This is so fascinating, and thank you for sharing the background. I think it's very, very important to understanding the struggle within Ukraine to really identify what a true Ukrainian is according to their ideology.
Right.
Western, Mhm.
And can I say that for Western Ukrainians, it is a narrow definition that revolves around being Greek Catholic, speaking Ukrainian as your essential mother tongue. They don't, it's funny that in Ukraine, they don't use the term mother tongue. They use государственный язык or державная мова,
Mhm.
which is the state language. I myself always thought it was unusual to embrace the idea that the state must define your language for you rather than your community. But, you know, that's something you get used to when you live there. And so it's a very tailored definition to the people who reside in Lvov, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, and parts of I forget, Volyn, yeah, and parts of Volyn, the southern parts of Volyn Oblast. And the rest of Ukraine, and I'm talking here about central as well as eastern Ukraine, are basically, they speak a mixture. They are sometimes Greek Catholic, but more predominantly Orthodox. And they don't really fit into the image of what a true Ukrainian is. And so the struggle from the 1930s on in Ukrainian politics has been the attempt to impose this definition as the proper definition, to grant greater rights, if you will, to that definition of Ukrainians, and to, as a result of social pressure and government policy, to, over time, as quickly as possible, to eliminate the other Ukrainians, either by changing their behavior to get them to adopt a new definition of themselves as Ukrainian and change their behavior, or to force them to leave.
And Western pundits portray the Ukraine-Russia conflict without, of course, addressing these core issues that you just walked us through, the two Ukrainian identities. If we take Russia out of the equation, would the internal Ukrainian conflict still exist today?
Well, that's a tricky question, because the existence of Russia is the reason for the other Ukrainian identity. In other words, there's two other ways to describe a large part of the Ukrainian population other than Galician or Ukrainian. They have historically been called Malaros, or Little Russians, or Южно Россияне, so Southern Russians. And leaving aside the events of the war, the last decade, both of those have gradually fallen away, both of those definitions. But historically, they are the predominant definitions throughout the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century that were in common use. All the great Ukrainian writers, at least not necessarily identify themselves, but use the term interchange of Malaros with Ukrainian. Shevchenko, the great national Ukrainian poet, referred, among other things, to the people as Malaros, although the region itself is at the border. So Ukraina, Krai being region or often border region. So Russia's existence is the reason for the counterpoint to the nationalist identity. But you could say the same thing of the relationship between Poland and Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine exists as a counterpoint to Polish identity. And Poland looks at the four Western regions as what's it called? Schody, anyway, the Eastern territories. Their Eastern territories. The largest Polish military cemetery is in the center of Lvov. Again, the terminology there is Lviv in Ukrainian, Lvov in Russian, and Lvov in Polish as well. So it's interesting to see Poland supporting the current Ukrainian government for its anti-Russian position. But as we know, anyone who follows Polish politics knows that the Polish nationalist movement has a very bad reputation in Poland in general and in Polish politics and history. And one of the demands traditionally made by the Polish parliament is to acknowledge the genocide of Poles by Western Ukrainian nationalists in the 1940s, the early 1940s.
Yeah.
The Volyn massacre.
Volyn massacre, yeah. And of course, Poland and Ukraine are still fighting about the right to exhume those remains. And I think Ukraine...
Yes, that's right. That's part of the bigger history. I don't think the exhumation is sort of the tail end of acknowledging the history itself. And the historical discussion has gotten stuck on this issue of acknowledging, because once the genocide or the massacre is acknowledged, then you can treat the exhumed remains with respect. But apparently both sides are reluctant, they cannot come to an agreement on who is to blame. Who is to blame, essentially, for those events.
And just to add for our viewers who are not familiar with sort of Western Ukraine versus Central and Eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian language spoken in Western Ukraine is, as you mentioned, it is very much a mix of Polish, some Hungarian, and some sort of, it cannot be classified as a true Ukrainian language, because it's very much influenced by the Polish culture and Polish language. So I think very often it seems to be misunderstood that the Western Ukraine sort of represents nowadays is that true Ukraine, but it's very much a mix of, as you mentioned, its historical past.
The classical Ukrainian speech it started with Kotlяревsky. So Kotlяревsky's Aeneid sort of set the tone for classical Ukrainian language. And Kotlяревsky was in Poltava, so which is east of the Dnieper. And the effort to build up a proper Ukrainian discourse that would be reflected over a large swath of the territory of the southern territory of the Russian Empire was undertaken by the University of Kharkov, the Imperial University of Kharkov, and of course with support by liberal circles in the port at St. Petersburg, who encourage it not as for separatist reasons, but as reconnecting with the roots of an older Proto-Slavic tradition. And that's also an important aspect of this discourse, to remember that nationalism is a very recent political phenomenon, whereas cultural intertwinings and the sources of what we think of today as distinct nationalities, they all melded together and began to emerge in clearer distinction really only around the 17th century. But even then, we know from the correspondence and the documents of Bogdan Khmelnytsky and the various treaties that were signed between the Cossack hetmanates and the Tsar in Moscow, that the two terms, Ukrainian being the geographic region and Malaros, or just Ruskiye sometimes, just Russians, was the common way to define the people living in Ukraine, who were distinct because of their religious identity being Orthodox versus the Polish Catholics. And so the clear way to distinguish that was to speak of them as all Russians, meaning by that Orthodox of whatever nationality, being subjects to the Tsar of all the Russias. The Russias being a plural concept, even up to the fall of the Romanov dynasty, sort of the early 20th century.
In a post-Maidan Ukraine, what role have the governments of former Ukrainian presidents Poroshenko and now Zelensky played in promoting the Galician identity, likely at the expense of denying agency to millions of Ukrainians who live in southern and eastern and central Ukraine, as you pointed out?
Right. Although I think it could be argued that they didn't do much for the agency of Western Ukrainians either. In other words, the real ambition of all, not just post-Maidan, but post-2004. I think Kost Bondarenko, who is a very interesting Ukrainian analyst, points out, I think he argues that the events of 2014 were set in motion really by Viktor Yushchenko, President Yushchenko in 2004, and the great conflict between over, I should say, the election of 2004 and who actually won it, Yushchenko or Yanukovych. Yanukovych, we must in retrospect say, graciously conceded to the victory to Yushchenko, who made a mess of it, leaving office 4 years later with a popularity rating of just 6%, leading directly to Yanukovych's revanche victory. And much of that dissatisfaction with Yushchenko came because of his insistence on emphasizing the Western Ukrainian component of the multinational Ukrainian identity at the expense of all the other identities. And here we're not just talking about Malaros Ukrainians, but also people of Hungarian origin, mixed marriages in southwestern Bukovina, southwestern Ukraine. We are talking about Poles. We are talking about Romanians and Bulgarians, which have their own communities, and I would say suffer the same restrictions on their identities as Russian-speaking Ukrainians do. They often rely on Russian as their common language among, I would say, the national minorities of Ukraine, because there is no legal recognition of minority status for any nationality in Ukraine. It is a hard nationalist agenda. And this predates any military conflict. This predates even 2014. There was the noted, and I think largely positive for Ukraine, historical example of the language law of 2012. The Kivalov, and I forget now the co-author, the Kivalov language law, which had a co-author, which allowed any region in Ukraine with a 10% minority language to allow that secondary language to be used in legal documents locally. And that was passed in 2012 under Yanukovych. But it was also the first act revoked by the Maidan government, the government that came to power after the Maidan. And there was a lot of surprise about that in Western circles, and they tried to downplay the significance, but it speaks volumes about what the Maidan was about. The Maidan was the coup of the militarized and militant nationalist sections of Western Ukraine who funded the occupation of Kiev, mostly Kiev, not so much other areas, because I was living at the time in Odessa, and I can tell you that many people, I can't speak to percentages, but I would say the typical response was to be perplexed at what was happening in Kiev at the time, and disappointment at how much was being done, so how much pressure was being put by paramilitary groups on the legal government, and why the legal government was not responding. Indeed, the acting governor at the time, Nicolai Skorik, was one of those who asked for the imposition of martial law in order to settle the country down and determine the future course of action in a legal framework. But of course, the Maidan itself preempted that and prevented, I would say, any kind of political reconciliation, because as your viewers might remember, in February 22 of 2014, February 22nd, there was an agreement negotiated by the EU states to allow for a peaceful transition of power from Yanukovych to an interim government headed by one of the opposition leaders, a parliamentarian at the time called Yatsenyuk, Arsenij, with elections to be held, early elections to be held by, I think, within a year, by February 2015. But the militants preempted that by storming the parliament and seizing control and preventing the existing parliamentarians from taking their seat. And what made the difference in accomplishing this coup was that the Western governments that had signed and ratified that agreement the very next day said they would not stand and defend it. And Yanukovych, in the interim, the next day, had left for a political rally in Kharkov, and in Kharkov, he was removed from power, and no one stood in his defense, which would have been at that time the defense of the constitutional order. Unfortunately, people saw it as a defense of Yanukovych himself. And that's unfortunate, because if political leaders had had the foresight at the time to stand up for the constitutional transition of power, probably none of this would have happened.
Is it fair to say that Yanukovych was the last democratically elected president of Ukraine?
No, probably not, because democracy doesn't ask for much. It just asks for a tally of votes and a percentage. Percentage can be 51% or thereabouts. It can be large, it can be small. It just needs to be a bare majority. And it does appear that in the aftermath of all the chaos that the country went through in 2014, Poroshenko's election was one that he won that election. And even Vladimir Putin, Russia's Vladimir Putin said, sort of eased tensions at the time by saying, we recognize the legitimacy of these elections. And we hope that they will lead to a resolution of the conflict in the eastern portion of the country, which, however, instead of resolving, Poroshenko instituted, I should say, continued what his acting predecessor, Alexander Turchinov, had instituted as an anti-terrorist operation, anti-terrorist operation in Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast. And then 2 years later, he changed the designation of the anti-terrorist operation again to an outright defense of Ukraine. So I think it was just a military operation, and retroactively designated Russia as the reason for the initiation of this military operation, even though it was not initiated as a military operation against Russia, but as an anti-terrorist operation against the insurgents at the time in Donetsk and Lugansk. And then there were all sorts of skirmishes. This led to Minsk I Accords, then Minsk II Accords. And over the following, subsequent, I should say, 8 years, many efforts were made to get Ukraine to accept and implement the terms of Minsk II, but they always rejected them and found a way to avoid implementing them. And when the Russian side today argues that they do not want merely another ceasefire, but a comprehensive peace treaty with Ukraine, I think it is in large part a reflection of the 8 years of unsuccessful negotiation in an effort to bring about the implementation of Minsk II that has been the experience, that was the experience of all the participants of the Minsk II process from 2014 to 2022. I should say 2015 to 2022.
I think your book does such a great job of discussing the origins of the far right movement in Ukraine, and that's certainly one of the, I think, main topics these days. And so you noted that the far right does not see itself as in any way subordinate to the government, but rather as a parallel instrument of popular control. And as long as Kiev follows the path of Galician development, the far right is content, and there's not going to be, roughly speaking, another coup or an attempt at a coup. And of course, this undermines the principles of a liberal democracy, since in a post-Maidan Ukraine, cultural pluralism and freedom of expression, whether it is cultural or religious expression, have been quite literally persecuted. And so the rise of the far right is, of course, a separate topic, but maybe very briefly, could you maybe walk us through how this transformation, the process of transformation of a marginal Galician movement into effectively a shadow power structure in Ukraine, in the modern Ukraine?
I think two things contributed to this rise, which was slow but impressive in its creeping control over governmental institutions. One is funding from Western Ukrainian sources. I should say from the funding from emigre sources. So Ukrainian emigres. The funding comes in the early 1990s from Ukrainian emigre sources. And eventually they are also embraced by Western funding sources, which are pro-democracy. So the various Soros-funded organizations, but also the National Endowment for Democracy, all the various pro-democracy movements. And the reason for that, it has nothing to do with those organizations themselves, with the, I should say, the Western Ukrainian nationalist organizations. It has to do with the fact that they are fighting against Russian influence. So whereas they are fighting largely Russian cultural influence, which means they're also fighting or trying to suppress the impact on Ukrainian politics of other Ukrainians who are predominantly Russian speakers or would have an affinity with Russia. That identity itself makes them, in the eyes of these Western organizations, quote unquote, pro-Russian. So Yanukovych, who is not pro-Russian, becomes targeted and labeled as pro-Russian. He's not pro-Russian, he's pro-Ukrainian, but pro-Eastern Ukraine. He supports the industrialists in Eastern Ukraine. He wants the Eastern Ukrainian territories, which are the largest contributors to GDP and have the largest population, to also be the most influential in the Ukrainian parliament. And the Western Ukrainian nationalists use this as an argument to gain support, political support, and funding support from the West by simply labeling anything east of the Dnieper River as pro-Russian. Or as being an example of Russian influence. And of course, it's nothing of the kind. It is simply the historical reality of Eastern Ukraine as it has existed, well, I would say, from time immemorial. And so that's been the main influence in terms of its steady rise in power, which led, I believe, in 2010 to the Svoboda Party, freedom, but actually it has some very intricate and nuanced definitions for the cognoscenti of what Svoboda means. It means our Ukraine as well, or our God-given Ukraine, the nationalist organization, which the EU Parliament at the time condemns and asks other political forces in Ukraine to have nothing to do with. At the time, it gains 10% of the seats, which is the maximum that a clearly right-wing nationalist organization gains in the parliament. But then what puts it over the hump, so to speak, and makes it truly puts the far right at the center of Ukrainian politics is, of course, the Maidan and the conflict, the deaths of the Maidan, because the Svoboda parties, the right sector, all there are a slew of smaller organizations which are coordinated by the political elite in Western Ukraine, the right-wing political elite. All of these parties, from the beginning, from late 2013, already understand or predict that this is going to be a military conflict. And in order to prevent the use of the Ukrainian police and militarized police against the Maidan supporters, they know that they need to arm. And they do, in fact, smuggle weapons into Kiev. They seize armories throughout Western Ukraine, and they begin the establishment of a military resistance, which proves in January, by the end of January, there are the first confrontations with deaths and shootings, and then the shootings in February as well, is a result of the fact that there are two well-armed military entities fighting in Kiev itself. And the rest of the story of the Maidan and the conflict in eastern Ukraine is simply the extension of this militarized conflict in Kiev to the rest of the country. Fortunately, there were regions where it was avoided, luckily, in Odessa and most of southwest Ukraine and western Ukraine, because the local Russian population had already essentially effectively been suppressed there. But the target audience of this militarized campaign was clearly in the east, which is why you see not only military conflicts in Donetsk and Lugansk, but also in Kharkov and in other regions to lesser extent. I do talk about in my book why only 3 regions fell to, or let's say, seceded from Ukraine and sought to join Russia. So that's Lugansk, Donetsk, and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. A lot of it has to do with local composition of the relationship of the local politicians to local oligarchs, and how much of a local militia, local oligarchs were willing to fund, and whether there was a true popular impetus behind the local militias, as there were in Lugansk and Donetsk, and in Crimea, obviously, as well. But the example of Crimea, it's the bloodless transition, was also the ideal that the insurgents in Lugansk and Donetsk wanted, but it didn't succeed because Russia did not support them. They did not support them at the time. They wanted a peaceful reintegration, Russia did, in 2014 through 2022. The whole Minsk process is an effort to get Ukraine to accept Lugansk and Donetsk back into Ukraine, but with certain rights to cultural autonomy. That's all. But Ukraine couldn't. The interesting aspect of this whole process is that the current Ukrainian government, so this is already Poroshenko and Zelensky, could not accept even a limited cultural autonomy for those regions in the Ukraine, the modern Ukraine that they envision the country being today.
So Zelensky ran on a peace platform, and he is Russian speaking. He grew up in Kryvyi Rog, so this is a Russian speaking city, a large industrial center. And he, when you look at those interviews that he gave at that time, he spoke about ending the war in the Donbass. He spoke about reunification, and he spoke about the importance of allowing Russian-speaking Ukrainians to speak Russian. Of course, that changed completely, and now we hear, his rhetoric is completely different. It's very Russophobic, but it's also targeting Ukrainians, millions of Ukrainian citizens who, just as he did, grew up speaking Russian. So that to me, means that the far-right movement, that Galician ideology really transformed and had a major major effect on the Ukrainian politics. How powerful is the far-right movement in Zelensky's Ukraine today?
Well, as long as the military conflict continues, the confrontation can be milked in order to create hostility. One of the reasons that the Ukrainian side is reluctant to engage in any long peace negotiations, not just the ceasefire, which would allow them to rearm and potentially then not concede defeat, but potentially always be in the mode of anticipating the reconquest of the lost territories. But what Russia is seeking, Russia wants to avoid that and settle the terms of the relationship and move on to a better relationship. But as Putin says, this begins with acknowledging Ukraine's defeat. And the Ukrainians acknowledging that they have lost the military conflict and need to sue for peace. So the question, as I understand it, that you pose is why is he pursuing this policy? Well, at this point, he has put himself into a very difficult corner. His only legitimacy inside Ukraine comes from the hard nationalists who support an all-out war to, if necessary, to the last Ukrainian. And that has consciously been stated by a number of Ukrainian nationalist leaders, specifically because any other Ukraine would not be worth living in. So if all Ukrainians have to die in order to be martyrs to the cause of a different Ukraine, totally Ukrainian Ukraine, then so be it. It just that is fate. But there is no party for peace that Zelensky can rely on, because he has not allowed such a party to have a voice in Ukrainian politics since before the beginning of the war. The assault on the media, the popular media in Eastern Ukraine, and therefore, just numerically, the most popular media in Ukraine, began in early 2021 with the sanctions, internal sanctions that he himself imposed, or say the National Security and Defense Council recommended and then he then signed on Viktor Medvedchuk, a prominent Ukrainian oligarch, politician, former chief of staff of Ukrainian President Kuchma, and a number of other Ukrainian political outlets. So the ownership of all the private media was essentially taken out of private hands and put in the hands of people who were at least loyal to Zelensky, loyal to the regime. And this accentuated or accelerated the hostilities in Eastern Ukraine and gave sort of, I would say, allowed an easier transition in the first days of, I should say, the first few months of the military conflict in 2022 to simply nationalize everything. So right now, we still have what's called a unified telethon. So there's one source of news for the entire country, and everyone else comments, bloggers. I wouldn't say there's much in the way of journalism, but essentially internet bloggers do so at their own risk. Every independent media outlet has been either shut down or forced to move abroad. Now, what's interesting to note is that these sites remain among the most popular in Ukraine. They have the largest number of followers, and people who are well regarded, certainly not pro-Russian, but independent analysts. And here I would name some names like Sergei Datsyuk, Andrei Yermolayev, Alexei Arestovich, who was himself a former advisor to President Zelensky, Andrei Baumeister and Kost Bondarenko, among others. All of these are among the most widely listened to political analysts. What I like about them is that they don't just talk about current events. These people in particular try to put these events in some sort of deeper context of Ukrainian history and Ukrainian consciousness, which makes them especially interesting to me. But if you look at on a popular media outlet, still Strana UA, which has to constantly change its domain name in order to escape Ukrainian and EU censors, as well as the independent Orthodox journalists website for Ukraine also has been suppressed and tried to find refuge in other domains. Those are two very popular sites that people try to follow because obviously any alternative voices that they could possibly get from Russia are simply totally suppressed. But with the assistance of our Western colleagues, many of these people are also occasionally, their commentaries are also removed from the internet for a while.
What might the future hold for the really majority, millions of people in Ukraine who identify with the Malorus Ukrainian identity at this point?
Well, this sort of follows up what I forgot to say in answer to your previous question. Wars cannot last forever. Wars feed on hatred. And as long as the hatred can be sustained of your enemy, the war can be sustained and justified. For whatever reason, when peace arrives, when there is a peace settlement, it becomes impossible to sustain the hatred. And as a result, everything that had previously not been possible again comes flooding back into people's consciousness, flooding back into people's families. Remember, 1 out of every 5 Ukrainians has close relatives in Russia. Now, you hear a lot of stories. They don't talk, I can't talk to those people anymore. I don't want to say, I don't want to discuss any politics. We've gone our separate ways. Fine. That's understandable in a war context. But a year, 2, 3, 5, what do you do when your young son asks whatever happened to, Dядя Боря or whatever, Uncle Boris in Tambov or wherever? Why don't we ever hear from him? Can I go visit him? All the human realities come flooding back. There's nothing peculiar about this. This has happened in every war. I like to remind American viewers in particular that we've had 10 major military conflicts with Mexico. And what? We took over half the country. Half of Mexican territory is now the Western United States. And so what? Americans go and vacation, have residencies, like to spend time in Baja California and all sorts of things. So life will go on eventually. So you cannot at all extrapolate what the relationship will be 5 years after the end of a conflict from what it is today. And 5 years is a relatively short time. I can easily imagine, because I experienced it personally as a young man in Western Europe, how an older generation would carry forward their resentments of Germans, which is, I lived in Germany at the time as a young man, but I would travel and I would go to Holland, other people of a certain age, if you spoke German to them, would be hostile or would not talk to you. Of course, young people, it didn't matter at all, 20 or 30 years after the war. And not to mention today, it's not hardly a recognizable issue. So I don't anticipate really anything different or unusual happen in that future relationship between Russia and Ukraine. What it will be will depend on how quickly normal neighborly relations are restored. And I think Russia will try to do everything it can to restore those relations because it's in its own interest to do so and to have a close relation, as close and intimate a relationship as possible with Ukraine. Many Ukrainians, Western Ukrainians, but others as well who have suffered losses in this conflict will probably be reluctant to do so. I would put no bets on their children's or grandchildren's attitudes, however.
Is it even possible for Ukraine to exist as a prosperous nation without reconciling and reestablishing ties with Russia? Because I would think that once there is an end to the conflict, as you said, there's just a purely human sort of level of connections that will be reestablished with time, but also on the sort of greater European and maybe even Eurasian level. What role does Russia play in that security arrangement that will have to be discussed for the lasting peace to actually, become a reality?
I don't think Ukraine and its choices are really the reason for Russia's security dilemmas. It is rather the stance taken by the NATO alliance throughout the 1990s to not see in Russia a potential partner, to, as we know, reject Russia's requests for membership in NATO 4 times, and to offer it no hope, no prospect of ever being part of the military and security framework of Europe, but to always be outside of it. And of course, being outside of it inevitably makes you suspicious of the intentions of the people who are keeping you out. And I think all of this came to a boil in Ukraine, but it could have come anywhere. It could have come at any peripheral point had the same effort been made by NATO to totally absorb and transform Ukraine into an anti-Russian bulwark, to build, as we know, NATO bases in the South with British funding, naval bases that would challenge Russia's supremacy in the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov being independent, but essentially the Black Sea is the main sticking point, I think. And at every turn, essentially discouraging, and not only NATO, by the way, the EU as well, as we saw in the aftermath of the negotiations of the Maidan, and leading up to the Maidan and afterwards, the EU Association Treaty already in 2013 contained clauses that prevented the preservation of what was at the time a very lucrative trade exemption status for Ukrainian goods in not just Russia, but the entire CIS through Russia. And the EU insisted that Ukraine give up that privilege and look only to the EU. Again, setting up really a dichotomy, a divide between either you're with us or you are against us. This was sadly the EU policy. And the net impact, I think, has been to greatly weaken the international position of the EU and to fracture EU unity. I don't even think it has done a great service to NATO because I don't happen to think that the security of a country is best measured by the amount of money that is spent on weaponry, but rather on the cohesiveness of the alliance. I said a few years ago that there is no example in history of a country prospering by making a much larger and wealthier neighbor its enemy. That's just common sense, and I think you cannot think of a historical example of that. So to the extent that Ukraine's ambition is to be an enemy of Russia and to make it its enemy, it is shooting itself in the foot. The question is not, however, should not be framed, therefore, well, just be friends only with Russia, like shift from NATO to Russia, because that has its advantages, but it also has its drawbacks. For one thing, the EU and NATO are not ready to let go. They're still grasping. They're still holding on to Ukraine for dear life. The optimal solution, and I think, by the way, that this is the proper way to reach a negotiated settlement as well, would be for all the other parties to stand aside and let Ukrainians and Russians deal with each other directly. That, I think, will lead to the best results. I don't see any reason why Ukraine couldn't say, having proven on the battlefield that it is willing, Ukrainians are willing in large numbers to die for the existence and survival of their country, I think that point is now well made. And I think Russia has no qualms accepting the existence of Ukraine, but not as an enemy, not as a sworn enemy to the existence, really, of Russia, as hardcore nationalists repeatedly state, but rather as a neutral country. And I think it would be much to Ukraine's advantage to look to the examples of neutral countries that have thrived between hostile blocs: Finland, Cyprus, Austria, Ireland, that's just to mention the European countries, all of which have often and throughout history been more secure and done better than their neighbors who have been dragged into or joined one or another antagonistic military alliance. If that arrangement could be achieved, I think there's no reason to assume that a Ukraine that could stand and assert its independence, its true sovereignty, both with respect to Europe and with respect to Russia, but seeking favors from both equally and playing them off wisely against each other, as Yanukovych was trying to do in 2013, the end of 2013, in the EU association agreement, that I think would have led to an optimal expansion and manifestation of Ukrainian sovereignty, and I think is probably still the best course that could be recommended to Ukraine.
And maybe the last question for today, Professor. I would love to get your thoughts on this. So, US-Russia peace negotiations seem to have stalled, and while the United States says that it wants peace, it's also very much a co-belligerent, and it continues to supply weapons to Ukraine. Europe is very upfront with its intentions. It's pushing for the conflict to continue. What is your view on where we stand with peace talks, and how likely are we to see any meaningful progress anytime soon?
It's impossible to say. I don't even agree that the peace talks have stalled. The peace negotiations are a process that includes the diplomatic posturing. And the diplomatic posturing, which we're seeing now, I could never, oh no, that's unacceptable. By the way, let's meet, in Geneva next month to discuss that. But in private, not in public. Mm-hmm. The public posturing will go on for a long time. I forget how long the negotiations between the United States and North Vietnamese went on, but I remember the silliness that surrounded the first couple of months about, should we sit at a square table or a round table? Who gets to shake hands? Who says what to whom? All of this nonsense is part of, sadly, the negotiation process as it has come to be understood today. And it says very little about the discussions that are going on behind the scenes through back channels that we won't know about for a very long time. We will hear rumors about it that will be unconfirmed. However, one bright sunny day, we will wake up and find that a memorandum has essentially been agreed to, and that everybody's more or less on board with it. And the people who last month couldn't imagine doing anything of the sort, today are declaring victory. And that's the most important part of the posturing, because it all comes full circle. First, you start with the posture, then you go through the horse trading, the hard bargaining, and you wind up back at the posturing. We won. Everybody won. I won. You won, etc. Or what I don't acknowledge that what you define as victory is truly victory. What I got was true victory. And then they'll go and explain how they beat everybody else and got a better deal. And that's the normal diplomatic process at work. And we should really, I'm sure your viewers will be sophisticated enough to see through that and to understand that we're in this for the long haul. No one is eager to get a ceasefire, because if you avoid a ceasefire, the avoidance of the ceasefire creates pressure for a longer lasting peace. That's the main instrument. And as many diplomats have pointed out, there is absolutely no inconsistency between fighting and negotiating at the same time. I mean, this was the very definition of diplomacy and politics that Karl von Clausewitz left us in the 18th, I should say, yeah, 18th and 19th century. That war is the continuation of politics by other means. So expect to see the two continue until a saturation point is reached, until both sides have had enough. People sometimes ask me, why do wars continue? Why do they begin even? I mean, it would seem to be such a bad thing. That's what people misunderstand. My students often misunderstand. People want wars. People benefit from wars. People make money off of wars. Huge industries, conglomerates, people rise and fall. Political careers are made. All of this is the direct result of war. And as long as these people who are benefiting from this new condition of war are profiting, there's little reason for them to stop, to go to do about face. But once they have seen that they have gotten all that they can from this particular war, then the initiative passes over to this group of people who say, well, at this point, we can anticipate getting more profit from trade than from war. So the very same people will shift gears and start to say the opposite of what they said 6 months ago. And again, this is sadly the way things are in realpolitik, in the real world.
The Tragedy of Ukraine by Nicolai Petro is a truly unique book that is a must-read for those who want to gain a better understanding of the underlying causes of the Ukraine-Russia conflict and have a clear perspective on the generational tensions within Ukraine itself. I really enjoyed the book, and I will link Dr. Petro's book in the video description below. I highly, highly recommend it. Professor Petro, thank you so much for your time and for this absolutely fascinating conversation. I hope you come back because I know that the audience has absolutely loved it, and I have so many more questions for you too.
Thank you very much. I'm always available. Thank you.